what do you think is the reason that so much fantasy writers tend to write their works in the form of a trilogy?
I don't know. I have a couple of little theories, but really, like I said, the story decides. With my first series, I thought it would be one book. It got big. And when I looked at the finished product, I realised there were two minor conclusions a third the way, two-thirds the way through. So it wanted to be a trilogy. I had nothing to do with it. And my second one, I did find that the story seemed to fit very well in a trilogy format. The sequel, of course, is reflecting. It's meant to reflect the first series, the Black Mission trilogy. But my next series is also a trilogy, and again, I just looked at how much story I had, and it seemed to fit 3 books better than 2 or 5 or whatever. And I could have stretched it out to 5, but I know I would have only been adding filler, and I don't think you should do that. You should always have plot, not padding.
And why fantasy? What is your personal opinion? What makes this genre so attractive both to authors and to readers?
Well, the supernatural's always fascinated me. Ironically, I don't believe in anything supernatural, so I sometimes wonder if that's connected, but the fact that I don't really believe in anything supernatural means that I find the idea of it fascinating. Perhaps not as scary, if it's not real. But yeah, from an early age, fairy tales, mythology, children's books that had fantasy elements to them were the ones I always liked the most. I just find the idea of the impossible made to seem real is really, really interesting. Personally, I love books about dragons and dwarves and great quests and things like that, magical swords. I'll read that quite happily. For me, what I like to write about is magic and how magic might influence the way a society develops, or how a character behaves, or the possibilities that it would add to someone's life and things like that. So.
There is Juliet Marillier and Sarah Douglas and Jennifer Fallon and obviously you. I personally have the feeling that the Australian female authors really, how do I say it, they really did emerge on the international market the last few years. So why do you think there's a special reason on it, and do you feel that Australian female fantasy differs from, for example, US fantasy?
Yes, I do think it's different, but I'm not entirely sure why and exactly how. It's very hard to judge something when you're within it. Much easier to judge it from afar. So I think probably someone who's not Australian would be able to tell me more what the difference is between Australian fantasy and the rest of the world. But when it comes to why there are so many female fantasy writers in Australia, it's sort of a strangely complicated occurrence. We didn't really have a local market for fantasy until the 90s. And when the 90s came along, all of a sudden there were a lot of fantasy writers being published. We just emerged out of the woodwork. And most of the writers were female. Now, I'm not entirely sure why that is. It may be that a lot of publishing staff are female, so maybe they just prefer female writing, who knows? Or it might simply be that women were having an easier time finding time to write in their spare time, maybe. But there is a little bit of a perception in Australia that fantasy is what females read and science fiction is what men read, so maybe women just were reading and writing more fantasy because of that. Either way, I'm kind of hoping that it will even out, because there's certainly been talk on the internet about how overseas and outside of Australia, fantasy is a bit of a boys' club. And people are saying, what are we missing out on? What female writers are we missing out on? So I'm thinking, well, what male writers are we missing out on in Australia? There's some great male fantasy writers that we're just not publishing. So it's very interesting.
So, to your own work again, on your website, I've read, just confirmed that you write this new trilogy, which is... and for this you have to do quite some world building, or universe building, as you put it. So I'd be interested, what do you think is more important for a book you write? Is it more like world building or the character development?
Ooh, I think the plot. Like I said, story is the most important thing. So neither, I'd say plot comes first. And from plot you will get the character. The character has to be in a setting, that's the world. But you can have a fantastic world and fantastic characters, but if you've got no good story, then you don't have a story.